Welcome to Titubanti Testi 12, Binomio di lettura. We are online now. Grazie infinite della partecipazione. Ci tengo a ringraziare moltissimo Richard Armstrong da Houston e Lucas Spielhofer da Heidelberg per aver accettato di discutere il passo in questione. Si tratta dell'Odissea, un passaggio molto famoso tratto dal quinto libro. As you know, we are going to speak in English tonight. I mean, the two speakers are going to speak in English, but both are perfectly able to handle with questions asked in other languages, also in German or in Italian. So feel free to jump in. As you know, each speaker has 20 minutes time. And the first who is going to start is the one who accepted the proposal, in this case, Lucas. So Lucas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marco. I will try to share my screen again. Can everyone see my slides? Yes? Perfect. Then I will start.
We don't see the slides, Lucas.
Yes.
Something happened. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe you have. Yeah. Okay.
Do you see it again?
Yeah. Perfect.
Excellent. Okay, so then I'll start. Well, thank you so much, Marco, for this short introduction. As you mentioned, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Heidelberg. And I do want to begin my attempt at stumbling through this text with a confession. When Marco first invited me to discuss a passage from the Odyssey, I was a bit worried. Trying to do justice to such a monumental work of the history of Western storytelling is hard. In our collective imagination, this epic towers as a somewhat ancient monolith, a text put on a pedestal so excessively over the past 3 millennia that the ripples of its impact extend until the present day. Particularly, I am thinking of the recent film adaptations by Roberto Pasolini from last year, or the upcoming epic by Christopher Nolan set to premiere this July. You may have heard about them. Whether the episode from the 5th book of the Odyssey that we're discussing here today will appear in Nolan's adaptation remains to be seen. At first glance, it might even pass readers by. However, I think that this is a pity since it marks an essential point in the plot of the narrative. The building of Odysseus' ship leads us to the point in which the epic hero first sets sail to return to Ithaca, breaking the standstill of an easy life, preventing him from leaving his lover Calypso in the island of Ogygia behind. Of course, the image of the ship as denoting the beginning of a journey has a strong metapoetic connotation in ancient literature, where it also symbolizes the actual beginning of a poem or a song. And as we know, the following depiction of Odysseus' shipwreck is essentially what triggers the final stretch of the poem, leading to the adventurer returning home and reclaiming his title as king of Ithaca. Scholars have sometimes called the passage we're talking about today an exercise in poetic ornamentation and a technical account that notably contradicts the poetic virtuosity of the poem into which it is embedded. But I ask myself whether there is more to the passage than this. I have recently worked on similar works of early Greek literature, notably Hesiod's didactic poem on agriculture, The Works and Days, and have found that it too contains what one might call prima facie technical passages preceding some of the instructions that the poet gives. By looking at the passage of the Odyssey together with Hesiod's poem, I would like to argue for what I would like to call an aesthetics of construction in early Greek literature that somewhat differs from our modern aesthetic sensibilities. But first, let us go through the passage of the Odyssey real quick. As I mentioned, the plot of Book 5 begins with Odysseus on the island of Ogygia. After a decision by the Council of Gods that Odysseus is to return back home, Hermes demands that Calypso let the traveler go, after which she tells him the news and the two spend the night together. Our text begins with the break of dawn the next day. In a first section, Odysseus and Calypso dress themselves, after which she gives him a series of tools to work wood and shows him a part of the island where trees suitable for shipbuilding grow. After Calypso has left, Odysseus starts felling trees, smoothing their trunks, and cutting them to an equal length. Calypso returns and brings him drills with which he bores through the planks and fits them together to form the ship's hull, adding a deck, a mast, a steering oar, and a fenced protection against the waves. When Calypso returns a third time, she brings cloth with which Odysseus creates a sail and ropes to complete his ship. At the end, we learn that his shipbuilding endeavor from beginning to end lasted 3 days, after which Calypso sends him on his way back home. But we know that, as always on his travels, this is not how things play out, with him ending up on the islands of the Phaeacians instead. I would now like to share some impressions that stood out to me when reading the passage in Odyssey 5. One aspect concerns its strong focus on depicting manual labor. Odysseus uses a series of tools he receives from Calypso, such as axes, drills, bolts, etc., to chop, prepare, and hammer together wood. He creates ropes and sails from cloth and weaves fences from twigs and boughs to create rails on the deck of his ship. The verbal expressions used for his activities, which you can see on the screen, reasonably would enable a cognitive and active reading of the passage, suggesting that readers are to imagine the different activities involved in constructing a ship in their minds and bodies. In lines 249 to 251, Odysseus is intriguingly compared to a carpenter measuring out the size of a cargo vessel, which highlights his level of knowledge and skill in building. This underlines his agency and prowess as a multi-talented craftsman. At the same time, however, there is an interesting tension between Odysseus's role in building the ship in a short amount of time, one might say an almost superhuman task, and Calypso's influence on this process. Her presence structures the passage, triggering Odysseus's various actions in the first place. She reappears 3 times, and each time is introduced with an epithet as a divine goddess. Now, of course, epic epithets are not surprising in formulaic poetry, but still, the triple highlight of Calypso's divine nature creates an intriguing contrast with the seemingly superhuman deeds that Odysseus achieves. Scholars have noted that the massive shipbuilding tasks performed by the hero all on his own would normally require a team of men, and thus pondered what specific type of boat Odysseus could have reasonably built in that short amount of time, with many suggesting that we are to imagine not more than a simple raft. But the way the boat building is developed here, including the elaborate carpenter simile, gives the impression that Odysseus's vessel is a proper work of craftsmanship, a ship including a cargo space, a deck, railing, a steering oar, a mast, and a sail. Calypso's divine presence might remedy this seeming paradox of someone achieving something far beyond their physical capabilities. But then again, I ask myself in how far questions of realism are really helpful when we're talking about the fantastic depiction of epic poetry. In any case, it becomes clear that Odysseus, despite his knowledge in carpentry, could not have completed his task had it not been for Calypso's tools and raw materials. Another aspect that struck me concerns the more abstract conception of physical creation in this passage. While most of Odysseus' actions are expressed in concrete terms, we also find verbs suggesting a more creative dimension of craftsmanship. Odysseus not only fells trees, joins planks with poles, or installs masts, but he also creates, poieo, or contrives, technaomai, different aspects of his creation, which speaks to the intellectual activity related to his work and also opens up a more abstract reading of the passage. Especially when one considers that these terms, just like the image of the ship itself, carry metapoetic meaning in ancient literature. For example, the terms techne or poietes derived from these verbs come to mind here. This creative perspective on human ingenuity becomes even clearer when we compare the passage with a similar act of creation in Hesiod's works and days. In Hesiod's didactic poem, or the passage that I want to show you today, the speaker gives readers instructions on plowing and the preparation of tools used for such an activity. Let us look at the passage I'm talking about here. Of course, you don't have it in front of you, so I put the version on the screen, and I'll read Glenn Moe's Loeb translation really quickly. So we're in that section of the poem where the speaker talks about the sort of the preparations to do agricultural work, working the land essentially. He says, "When the strength of the sharp sun ceases from its sweaty heat at that time, be mindful and cut wood, a seasonable work. Cut a mortar 3 feet long and a pestle 3 cubits long and an axle 7 feet long. For this way things will fit together very well. If you cut a length 8 feet long, you could cut a mallet head from it too. Cut a 3-span broad quarter wheel for a 10-palm-sized cart. There are lots of bent timbers. Search for one on the mountain or through the fields, and if you find one of holm oak, take it into your house as a plow tree. For that wood stands up most strongly for plowing with oxen, when Athena's servant has drawn it near and attached it to the yoke pole after having fastened it with pegs to the plow stock. Toil hard to lay up a pair of plows in your house, one of a single piece and one put together, since it is much better this way. If you broke one, you could set the other one upon your oxen. Yoke poles of laurel or elm are the least wormy, of oak the plow stock, of holm oak the plow tree." Now, right off the bat, what might strike us is the way in which both the passage in the Odyssey and that in the Works and Days are anchored in the plot by a specific temporal introduction connected to the properties of the sun. You can see here, Amos, in both cases, and in one case, we have Eos appearing in the sky, and then the other case, in the case of Hesiod, we have the strength of the sun abating a bit as the right time to do this work. Now, in a catalog-like manner, the speaker instructs readers to fell wood to cut it into the shape of various tools while visualizing the future tasks that will be carried out with them. This is followed by instructions on how to use naturally occurring materials, such as branches and pieces of wood, to create different kinds of plows. The speaker advises to build 2 plows with different techniques and explains which types of wood are to be combined in their construction. I see various parallels between this passage and the passage in Odyssey Book 5, not least the strong focus on manual labor. The depiction of the concrete actions related to the creation of tools made from wood suggests a similarly cognitively charged and active conception that enables readers to imagine the process of constructing them, as they might have previously carried out these actions before. The artifacts in Hesiod, which is of course the addressee, like Odysseus in the boat building episode, is compared to a carpenter, referred to here as Athena's servant, Athenaeus Moos, who puts together the single parts of the plow and draws attention to different steps of assembly. In chronological order, he attaches a piece of wood to the plow stock, fixes it with bolts, and fits it to the pole. The concrete verbs denoting the worker's tasks in Hesiod are remarkably similar to the concrete action verbs used to denote Odysseus's actions in the Odyssey, as you can see here on the slide. For example, you have several parallels here, for example, the use of temno, hylotomeo, ararisko, titemi, histemi, and ballo, and other verbs. Notably, however, the more abstract terms denoting conception and artistic ingenium, so to say, notably poieo and technaomai, which we find in Homer, are missing in Hesiod, who has only poneo, the aspect of hard work, as an abstract equivalent, which I find is an interesting finding in two such similar constructive technical passages. Now, a particular aspect that the Hesiodic depiction displays, and that might further linked to depictions, concerns the relationship between nature and technology in early Greek society. Not only fashioning natural materials into shapes conceived by the human mind, but also integrating nature into man-made structures seem to be the focus of Hesiod's depiction of creating agricultural tools. And Odysseus' ship displays a similar combination of human ingenuity and natural raw materials. What Hesiod's account is almost completely devoid of, however, is the divinely fantastic element present in the Odyssey, represented by the figure of Calypso. While Hesiod's farmer builds his own tools from things he finds in the world around him, Odysseus receives the tools and building materials from the nymph ready for use. We thus do not find so much attention in the didactic poem between the human and the divine in the process of construction, but more so between natura and ars, between the grown environment and its transformation through human technology. One thing that fascinated me in both Homer and Hesiod was the idea of building and constructing as a prerequisite for the starting point of an activity. In Odysseus' case, a sea journey; in that of Hesiod, the agricultural journey of fieldwork. Both passages thus illustrate a certain moment or process of the before, so to say. I also thought about interesting parallels to the language of construction we still use when we talk about understanding and interpreting texts. Reception-oriented approaches, such as cognitive literary studies, for example, will often talk about the reader co-constructing a text's meaning, and studies on the experientiality of ancient literature often single out scenes depicting manual labor with tools or weapons as particularly vivid and engaging to a reader, hinting at the fact that there seems to be a deeper link between the act of constructing or working materials and a heightened sense of cognitive engagement. And indeed, commentators have singled out our passage in the Odyssey as, and here I quote Heuberg, a good instance of Homer's succinct descriptive style. These observations lead me to ask myself whether we can read a certain meta-dimension into both passages, and whether they can be about more than just manual construction of tools and vessels. This leads me to my final point, my summary, and in some way leads me also back to the beginning, because the question remains, why are the depiction of Odysseus' shipbuilding as well as the construction of Hesiod's plough given so much space in the Odyssey and the Works and Days? A view only on the realia of the passages probably sells their importance too short. However, if we look at the symbolic, even cognitive meaning of manual labor in these poems, we might see a bit further. As we have seen, both examples display a narrative pattern of procedural construction of technology in which chronological tasks are represented in the literary medium, with strata added line by line, propelling the building of ship and plow forward and creating a climactic effect, so to say, with the completion of the product signaling the starting point of the journey of both Odysseus and the farmer that follows. In the case of the Odyssey, the narrative significance of the boat building is especially salient, given that it jumpstarts Odysseus' homecoming sequence, whose endpoint is marked by another artifact crafted by the king from wood all on his own, his marriage bed in Ithaca, which completes the anagnorisis and reunification with his wife Penelope. But read together with Hesiod, I wonder whether Odysseus' ship is not also a good example of a certain aesthetics of construction in archaic Greek literature. That is the impression that both Homer and Hesiod display a certain basic interest in depictions of technical construction and craftsmanship in their poems, an aesthetic proclivity which might seem surprising to modern readers. However, if we consider human cognition as a factor in literary production, we might reflect on the level of expectations, the German Erwartungshorizont, so to say, that an early Greek audience could have had to which these depictions appeal. In an archaic community, building ships, tools, and using plows can be assumed to be a much more common element of everyday life and collective imagination. This enables the aesthetic experience of reading about the construction of these things to have a significant effect of recognition. For later or even modern audiences who may have made no such experiences, the fascination for such technical passages might not always be immediately apparent. So that is all from my side. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Lucas, for this wonderful presentation. There are so many aspects you touched upon that are really interesting. And of course, we are very much looking forward for Richard Armstrong's presentation, who is the one who proposed this text. And we are also grateful if Richard could tell us why this passage, what was the reason which caught your attention, Richard.
Certainly. So I hope you all can hear me well enough. So I think we put these in the correct order. Lucas's paper, I think, is perfect to precede mine, because my interest is really in the history of translation of epic, and the sort of problem of finding a way to connect with these moments of technical description, and still for poetic translators to feel in the target text of their own culture that they're creating a poetic texture, despite the fact that there may be things here that are technical jargon, right? So that interests me, as you can see in the long haul. I'm going to be talking a lot about English translation, which has a particular kind of trajectory from Fitzgerald on, but I will end with an Italian text, which, given the audience, I think is a good way to end, it turns out, since siete tutti qui, no? Let me just begin by sharing my PowerPoint. Is this coming online for you? Okay, this is going very slowly on my end for some reason. Okay. Are we good? Okay, good. So this text could seem like an odd choice for Testi Titubanti, as it's a straightforward description with no dialogue, there's no conflict, no dense lyrical digression, no theological conundrum, unless perhaps you're wondering why Calypso has a tool shed on Ogygia. The determined activity of Odysseus here in making his seacraft is the opposite of hesitation. This text does not titubare, but proceeds directly from felling timber to hewing it into lumber and shaping it into an improvised boat, a schedia, upon which the hero will depart Ogygia at long last. It's a singular moment of Homeric enargeia, a vivid description of craftsmanship that seems unique for an individual hero. Indeed, can you imagine Agamemnon shaving down planks, or Menelaus with an auger, or Achilles weaving wickerwork panels? Odysseus's cunning is traditionally tied to the Trojan horse, though Epeus was said to be the craftsman of that structure. But Odysseus seems uniquely suited to this act of auturgia, a do-it-yourself shipwright who sets to work chopping down 20 trees the moment he's been given the go-ahead and the tools. It seems the kind of thing a rugged islander and improviser would do. As with anything philology touches, though, this simple, vivid description can quickly dissolve into rivers of ink. Rarely, sorry, I'm going to get my slide to turn here. Rarely do we ask the big questions, like why does Odysseus make a craft only to have it utterly destroyed in the next book by the angry Poseidon? Apparently, Cesare Catin is enlisting the raft of Odysseus as a metaphor for life coaching. I've not read this book, but it really grabbed me. And this makes me wonder a little if maybe Schopenhauer had Odysseus in mind for his famous boatman metaphor. Sticking to just Homer, though, Book 6 of the Odyssey is memorable for Odysseus' heroic struggle at sea, which shows the limits of his agency, just as Achilles' struggle with the river Scamander shows that hero's mortal limitations. To think of the hero isolated on the high seas in a raft, as we traditionally translate Schedia in English, conjures a vivid picture of pathetic vulnerability, captured in N.C. Wyeth's memorable book illustration. Wyeth was a prolific illustrator for Scribner's Classics, and importantly, he was an American, because when you mention a raft to an American, his imagination defaults to Huckleberry Finn and his trusty craft that floats him and Jim down the Mississippi to the Missouri River. Down the Missouri River to the Mississippi. Illustrations to classic books often leave indelible childhood impressions. Alexander Pope readily admitted the images of John Ogilvy's folio editions got him hooked on Homer quite young. The problem is Huck's raft is nothing like what Odysseus builds, which instead, as the simile relates, has the ample dimensions of a merchant ship. It has ribbing and decking, a capacious interior filled with brushwood, perhaps ballasting materials and supplies. It's not just a flat deck of logs, but a structure of fitted planks pegged together. Why do we not see in our mind's eye what is so clearly being described? Cognitive dissonance, we might call it, or the conundrum of the technological in poetry. Descriptive language is supposed to fuse and fix the image, unless we are subjected to a jargon we don't really understand. The conflict between poetry and technicality is at the heart of my discussion translation today. Axes, adzes, augers, pegs and tenons, gunnels, halyards, braces. Do these words connect and conjure in the mind, or is this a mere verbal texture of technology? There's indeed a technical aspect of this passage that's long puzzled readers and can be resolved in the various games that philologists play. The archaeologically inclined can go down the rabbit hole of ancient ship construction, as verified in the few examples obtainable from wrecks and depictions. And this is to play, of course, the Enlightenment's game of looking for vraisemblance, a standard by which certain French critics found much fault with Homer in the 18th century. René Rapin declared it impossible for one man to accomplish so much in 3 days. Bossuet tried to help the matter by claiming it took 20 days, victim of a mistranslation that shows he was reading a Latin crib and not the Greek text, and we'll get back to that later. Alexander Pope enjoyed poking fun at the French controversy in his commentary on the passage, where the problem is neatly solved by simply declaring that, as this was a small craft, clearly Odysseus felled 20 small trees, something attainable in the given time. Now, While American boys have Huck Finn's raft to think of, English lads have the school tradition of competitive rowing to draw on, especially at that fancy place Eton, where Edmund Moore excelled at the oars before going on to Oxford. In 1884, in an article in the Journal of Hellenic Studies, Moore came out fighting in the first paragraphs as a scholar who knows his boats. This was a raft, not a boat, or even a rude imitation of a boat. Many of the difficulties connected with the well-known description of its construction in the 5th book of the Odyssey have been increased by the confusion of these ideas. He's ready to set you right on this matter with lots of details. His contemporary, William Walter Mary, did not agree, perhaps because he was a priest and not a rower, at least that I know of. Mary notes in his widely published school edition of the Odyssey, the Skydia here is treated as an ordinary ship of the period. There's nothing in the text to induce us to interpret it as the description of a mere makeshift. The whole story is a tale of marvel, and if Odysseus seems to have done more than any man could do, it's quite in the spirit of the whole passage. Mary is happy to let this be a proper ship, made extraordinarily fast by Odysseus, because this is a heroic act of carpentry, pointless though it is in the face of Poseidon's wrath. The Reverend Mary seems content to let this be a miracle, and he provides all the necessary jargon for the schoolboys, along with a lovely diagram of a ship. I don't know how many of you were raised on diagrams like this. This might have been as close to many ever came to putting out to sea. The 20th century invented some new ways to address the ship or raft question. Scholars interested more in the mechanics of oral poetry than ancient seacraft can claim that while indeed Odysseus is making a Skydia that should be thought of as a raft, what follows is the description of a ship, because, well, that bit was traditional. Look at George Dimick's odd footnote to his revision of the Loeb Library translation. In describing the construction of Odysseus's raft, Homer seems to have made use of a traditional poetic description of building a ship. Meaning what? Traditional poetry, if this is what he means by Homer, just went on autofill and downloaded the shipbuilding file? Where else is there such a description of shipbuilding? Appeals to formularity and tradition cannot fix every discrepancy in a text. But it's tedious to rehearse old controversies, so let's return to the poetic framing of this scene, which we can enhance by recalling Odysseus's other unique act of crafting, this one openly signaled as a sema in Book 23, as Lucas mentioned, the bed at home in Ithaca with its curious olive tree bedpost. More comes from the differences than from the similarities there. On Ogygia, Odysseus chops down 20 trees in a frenzy to get away from Calypso, whereas on Ithaca, he preserves the singular oak tree in the marriage bed that is his goal and return of rootedness, around which he builds the whole bedroom. Cunning and craft link up nicely between books 5 and 23, as Carol Doherty has argued, but the bed is a sign and a token of identity, while the boat is rather a useful thing. That is, unlike the Trojan horse itself, another cunning sign, this boat is just a boat, and sometimes a boat is just a boat. So I pivot now to consider the rather difficult interpretive challenge of poetic translation, which can be nicely thought of as interpretation by enactment. That's using James Holmes's felicitous definition. And I begin by invoking the melancholy comments of one of Homer's myriad translators, William Cooper, who was a sort of anti-pope of the 18th century. Cooper's idiom was Miltonic blank verse, not the smooth heroic couplet of the British Augustans. And you can see that retranslation, as we'll see, has its own gains. Retranslation is a triangulation between a source text and the emerging target text that you're creating in the translation, plus a whole previous series of other translations from which the new one must differ to justify its existence. In his introduction, Cooper complains about the hard labor of Homer's technical descriptions for the poet. It is difficult to kill a sheep with dignity in a modern language, to flay and to prepare it for the table, detailing every circumstance of the process. Difficult also, without sinking below the level of poetry, to harness mules to a wagon, particularizing every article of their furniture, straps, rings, staples, and even the tying of the knots that kept it all together. Homer, who writes always with to the eye, with all his sublimity and grandeur, has the minuteness of a Flemish painter. I think our passage would certainly qualify such a challenge. How much should the poetic translator worry that the reader will immediately spy some nautical nonsense? At what point do technical details cease to matter? And where is the poetic heart of this scene? I start with Robert Fitzgerald's Odyssey of 1961, because this comes at a moment of reset in English poetic translation. The Odyssey had long been assimilated to the novel, and prose translations had become the norm in English, including the breezy one by Evie Rieu that inaugurated the Penguin Classics series. At the same time, American poetry was undergoing its modernist reevaluation, and though Fitzgerald defined his diction to be, like Cary Grant's accent, mid-Atlantic, he does squirm about metrically in a manner that would characterize many 20th century translations. Ezra Pound, after reading a draft of Fitzgerald's translation, wrote to him, "Too much iambic will kill any subject." And you can almost sense Fitzgerald's deformation of certain verses to avoid, as he said, getting sing-song. Take the opening line, "When dawn spread out her fingertips of rose." That's perfect iambic pentameter, which runs up against the next line. Odysseus pulled his tunic and his cloak on, which almost feels like a swerve against a more predictable verse like Odysseus donned his tunic and his cloak. It's an interesting irony that in the endless discussion of gender and translation that women like Emily Wilson are bringing back, that it is women like Emily Wilson are bringing back the grand tradition of iambic pentameter in Homeric translation into English, which male poets of the 20th century, like Fitzgerald, Fagles, Lombardo, Stephen Mitchell, seem so edipally engaged in undoing. But we'll get back to that in a moment. But there's red meat here, Book 5, for a man to wield vigorous Anglo-Saxon words to match Homer's vivid verbs of craft. And Fitzgerald unlocks the word hoard with gusto to keep the verse alive, as he said. So this is what you're seeing on the screen. Now the man fell to chopping. When he paused, 20 tall trees were down. He lopped the branches, split the trunks, and trimmed his puncheons true. Meanwhile, Calypso brought him an auger tool, with which he drilled through all his planks, then drove stout pins to bolt them, fitted side by side. Fall, chop, lop, split, trim, drill, drive, bolt, fit. These glorious monosyllabic words impart an energy that give a sense of heroic vigor without worrying too much about the technical details of the construction. There's almost a frontiersman's machismo in the verse, split the trunks and trimmed his puncheons true. A great example of a line that bristles with convincing energy, despite the fact that few people can tell you, in fact, what a puncheon is. Well, to make a puncheon, you have to split a log, and then plane it into a plank or board. Fitzgerald's strategy is to give a quick series of active verbs, as in the Greek, but they're not all Homer's specific actions, as xese epistamenos describes rather the process of smoothing, not splitting. Similarly, is with which he drilled through all his planks, then drove stout pins to bolt them, fitted side by side, ignores a certain pedantry over mortises and tenons versus laced planks that exercises the minds of nautical historians. We sense instead a vaguer industry of drilling, driving, bolting, fitting. Here it's worth quoting one of Fitzgerald's notes to himself in draft material that you can find at Harvard University. They have all of his original notebooks as he was actually making the translation. The Homeric poem was a translation too. It was a translation of something imagined, of action, a dramatic action. And later in his notes, he states, the scholar's fidelity is to the text, the poet's to the movement of imagination behind the text. Translations, like elections, have consequences. When you hear about translation effect, you'll often find it to be something like this. Robert Fagles, who continued the revolt against iambic pentameter with his very, very loose lines, clearly digested the previous Robert, that is Robert Fitzgerald, while letting a bit of more Homer into his 1996 translation. He set to cutting trunks. The work was done in no time. 20 in all he felled. He trimmed them clean with his axe and split them deftly, trued them straight to the line. Meanwhile, the radiant goddess brought him drills. He bored through all his planks and wedged them snugly, knocking them home together, locked with pegs and joints, and split them deftly as a compromise between Fitzgerald's split the trunks and Homer's excessid epistaminos, deftly adding skill to the act while foregoing the vain attempt to find a 5-syllable English adverb to match Homer's. I don't think we have any 5-syllable English adverbs. Trim and true return, though in different positions, and still the alliteration locks them in. Forgive me if I don't bother to tell you the difference between an auger and a drill. It's all rather boring, which is a terrible pun, and I apologize for that. But here again, we got the energetic sequence of boring, wedging, knocking, locking. Now, the Homer industrial complex, as I like to call it, has produced a dizzying number of translations in English just since the year 2000. In fact, over 30 into English. But none has quite achieved the public success of Emily Wilson's. Let me bring that on. Unlike her Iliad, this was a project that set out to match Homer line for line, even though matching iambic pentameter with dactylic hexameter is often a very uneven trade, like setting the US dollar and the pound sterling at parity. But she's writing against the flabby flexibility of 20th century verse translation and its loose meters. Here, her signature poetics of reduction is sharply evident. Her slimmed down lines have the simplicity of Hemingway's prose. Odysseus began and made good progress. With his bronze axe, he cut down 20 trunks, polished them skillfully, and planed them straight. Calypso brought a gimlet, and he drilled through every plank and fitted them together, fixing it firm with pegs and fastenings. Her iambic pentameter is subtle and highly variable, modeled more on Shakespeare than the Augustans. Consider the regularity of Calypso brought a gimlet, and he drilled against the jaunty opening dactyls and polished them skillfully and planed them straight. Or the 11-syllable opening line, Odysseus began and made good progress. Like Shakespeare's to be or not to be, that is the question, it opens with the 11-syllable so-called feminine ending, which is an unfortunate misnomer in English coming from French prosody for an iambic verse that ends in an unstressed syllable. Now, Wilson, an Englishwoman living and teaching in America, is another example of what we might call mid-Atlantic translation, like Fitzgerald. She has a deep sense of English poetry in addition to all the training of a classical philologist. Wilson has a remarkable ability to reduce translation to very limited elements, as if to check any desire for exaggerated over-translation. There's nothing in her version to make you think cutting down 20 trees is particularly impressive. Roberts make more of it. 20 tall trees were down, says Fitzgerald. 20 in all he felled, says Fagles, both putting to work something they draw from Homer's Ecose ekbara panta. Fitzgerald's verbal sequence of chop, lop, split, trim, drill, drive, bolt, and fit, for Wilson is a calmer cut, polish, plane, drill, fit, and fix. We've arrived at a simple craftsman, not the heroic boatwright of yore. Now, to touch base with that more heroic tradition of translation, one which subsequent translators are often writing against as much as writing after, we should return to Alexander Pope, the first poet to make a fortune by translating Homer, we should recall. Homer leaves no doubt as to the heroic nature of Odysseus's woodcraft. Now toils the hero, trees on trees o'erthrown, fall crackling round him, and the forests groan. Suddenly full 20 on the plain are strode, and lopped and lightened of their branchy load. At equal angles these disposed to join, he smoothed and squared 'em by rule and line, the wimbles for the word Calypso found. With those he pierced 'em, and with clincers bound. I'm interested in the distance that we've covered here, from the heroic toil of Pope to the craftsman's focus of Wilson's complicated man, as she dubs Odysseus at the start of her translation. It will be interesting to see what the consequences of Emily Wilson's more reductive poetics will be for the future of Homeric translation in English. She's already moved beyond her own line-for-line translation practice in her Iliad, which some might find a more honest method. Translations have consequences, as I've said, though it will take perhaps a few decades to see what these will be in the new millennium. But mistranslations also have consequences. Now, I mentioned translation effect earlier, and I wish to end with a rather interesting transformation by Lodovico Dolce, the great Renaissance poet, whose Ulisse of 1573 is a curious rifacimento of the Odyssey into the ottava rima of Ariosto and Boiardo. When the first Greek-Latin editions of Homer came out in the Cinquecento, a curious mistranslation of Equasi decbale panta crept in, reading Bigenti diebus in 20 days instead of 20 trees. It took until the 18th century for that translation to be purged in the various Latin versions printed with Greek text. Dolce, who almost certainly relied more on the Latin than the Greek of his edition, took the initiative to double down on Odysseus's heroic agency here. The fairy Calypso informs Ulisse, as he's called, he is a cavaliere, that he will have to be both architect and builder of his own vessel. Drawing on that reading of 20 days, Dolce added an important design phase into this heroic activity. In a very Ariostoan moment, he praises the hero's ingenuity at building a galley worthy of the Venetian arsenale. In 20 giorni, avendo designato da legno il corpo con l'ascia tornato, pulito sì che nulla l'offendea, e l'un con l'altro al sesto conficcato, fece il mastro perfetto una galea, la quale gli riuscì sì belle tale, che mai il nostro arsenal non ne fa uguale. Ecco quanto può fare l'ingegno umano. Fu la professione del greco accorto di buon soldato, il miglior capitano, né alla milizia mai fece alcun torto, orfato e di galee mastro sovrano, sol da naturi vive ingegno scorto. Vive l'antenne, il lavoro del timone, e tosta fina bel lavoro pone. Where Fitzgerald saw the virile energy of a man with an axe, Dolce has given us a hero, spontaneously combining design and sovereign craftsmanship. In other words, Dolce made Odysseus a Renaissance man. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard and Lucas, for this wonderful discussion over this very rich text, I must say. Of course, it is about technology, it is about poetry, it is about language, so many things that come together. As usually, I mean, we have 30 minutes. I'm going to ask Lucas whether he would like to offer a brief comment, and then please let me know if there are questions, observations, whatever you like, a comparison, whatever you like to add to the discussion. We are a small group of people, so we do have definitely the possibility of having a dialogue. Lucas.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. This was wonderful, and I think complemented. I think both our papers complemented each other quite well. I was also struck by this contrast between technicality versus poeticity in a way, and also, of course, the question of how do we actually translate these kinds of things. I may have one question that is maybe more specific, but might be interesting to open up a larger discussion. I read through some of the translations, especially the English translations of this passage, and for example, in my paper, one of my arguments sort of relied on a translation of an epithet of Calypso in a way, sort of this divine nature that she embodies. And it is quite interesting to see, if you look at the different translations, that most of them sort of gloss over that specific point. And I ask myself, why is that? I mean, of course, there's this kind of repetitiveness, and maybe for modern ears that sounds something that's not stylistically polished or something. So I was wondering, sort of, as you were saying, in how far does a translation also sort of heighten or highlight certain aspects and also obstruct others in a way? I don't know. It's not really a question, but sort of like more of a thinking out loud in a way. Yeah.
Well, it's a fundamental question in modern translation. To what extent does the formularity and repetition of Homeric verse need to be represented to give adequate sense of what this traditional poetry is like? And what you'll find is, an awful lot in the English tradition, an awful lot of poets do not want to do that level of repetition, but they often do reinterpretation. So, for example, the line about the rhododactylos eos, in Emily Wilson, she just rewrites it each time in sort of different vivid ways, right? As opposed to repeating it line for line. And but the Dia Feaun, it's a really interesting point that you make up. What I've always found interesting since the Scholiasts and also in the 18th century commentaries, they're very interested in how Calypso keeps coming back to him as if she is a lover who does not want to sort of end this relationship. She keeps coming back, even though she's coming back to give him tools, right? And again, it's really interesting. In the 18th century, they like to contrast Dido and her relationship with Aeneas when he's leaving versus Calypso and Odysseus. There's a really kind of a fascinating amount of energy in the 18th century about that issue. But again, you can see this already in the Scholiasts, right? In the Scholia, talking about this. So the thing that I've always found interesting is the particular vivid technical things have to be made present to the modern imagination. And we get farther and farther away from so many of the processes that are described. And so it almost doesn't matter whether it's correct or not, archaeologically speaking, right? Provided that it's vivid. And this is something that Fitzgerald was clear about. He thought that, even the original Homeric poem is a translation of an imagined event, right? And I've had conversations with other translators like Stanley Lombardo, where, again, they sort of feel that rather than simply trying to penetrate some other person's poet's imagination, you try to put yourself in the scene. And I think in English translation, especially in the 20th century, when you look at the dialogue, very often the dialogue is reimagined theatrically. And as a consequence, there's a tendency for a certain amount of over-translation. And Emily Wilson has been, I think, really interesting in challenging that tradition, the 20th century, tradition of over-translation to increase dramatic height, and of course readability for the modern reader. One of the things that she points out, though, is in order to heighten that dialogue, they often use words that Homer never uses, calling the slave women, for example, in Ithaca, sluts or whores or things like this, which, again, from her perspective, is adding more misogyny than is in the text, right? So at first, I sort of struggled. I wrote 2 different reviews of her Odyssey, actually, because it's so pared down that it sort of, you feel this loss of energy almost. But I realized that's part of the effect of constantly reading these other translations that are, to a degree, extremely heightened, over-translated to a certain degree. So now I've kind of appreciate her resetting of this horizon, And what's also interesting, of course, is she's brought back iambic pentameter, as other translators are doing more and more in English. So a traditional verse form that's quite regular. This seems to be something that is happening. There's a recent translation by my colleagues in Houston of the Aeneid. They've done the same exact thing. So again, the translation is always an interesting thing when you think about the resources of the target language, right? And how something like an ancient poem leads to an almost archival research into the language itself, into the target language itself, not just the Homeric Greek, right? But looking at the language in which you're writing. One example that might interest you, Lucas, is both Fitzgerald and Emily Wilson have the idea about, the withy that he said to make wicker work screens as a bulwark against the waves. They actually interpret this differently, that he takes the withy and he sticks it between the planks as caulking. And at first I was thinking, where does that come from? It actually comes from book 40 of Nonnos. Nonnos uses the language of the Odyssey to rewrite Dionysius's command to create a ship for him, and he's the one who introduces this idea. And I don't know if that's a thing or not, but to me it's always seemed like there's a wickerwork screen on deck against the waves crashing on him while he's aboard. So that's a great example, though, of like, does it matter? You can envision them. What's being described by the poet translator can be envisioned well enough, right? But this is one of those great questions. Similarly with similes, similes are meant to be very vivid, right? But when similes involve something that may not be vivid to a modern audience, there's that interesting challenge of if the Homeric language itself is making present the past, should the modern translator have the freedom to make the simile more immediately relevant, and that's why I love what Dolce does in talking about the Arsenale. He brings the ship of Odysseus right into the Venetian present, right, by talking about it. It's a galley, just like we make in the Arsenale.
Right, which also corresponds to the kind of pictorial settings used in that time. I'd like to add, if I may, if nobody else would like to ask a question, I'd like to add some other observation to your very fine readings, Lucas and Richard. First of all, the thing that this scene obviously creates a certain suspense, like it's not suspense really, but it freezes the action because it prepares another action. So I like the idea that technology, these technological moments serve in order to precisely slow down the development of the narrative. I'm not a Homerist, so I don't know whether, I mean, possibly you have many other passages where this is the case, but it struck my attention precisely for that. And then another, let's say, layer of complexity, but also maybe critical, which also is in critical dialectical relationship to what you said, especially Lucas, is the fact that actually we tend always to read these technological moments, or also trees, especially the use of trees, the use of environmental elements, which is the case here. Always we tend, as Western readers, like with our own poetic imagination, to associate them, to read them metaphorically. Okay. Oh, this is of course a declaration of poetics, right? This is something which is connected to language. I don't want to say that this is wrong, but maybe we should also look at these environmental elements in their being concrete elements, okay? Like those trees, their peculiarity, the way they are used. So this would be like an eco-critical invitation to consider those elements not symbolically, but really in their concreteness again, and the fact that actually they do have a certain agency, because this is thanks to them, thanks to those trees and this work, can Odysseus continue his travel, and we readers can continue reading. I mean, reading or listening to, it depends from which perspective. But this is very interesting. So they are actually active agent, and this is always the case when you start considering environment from a perspective which is not symbolic, which is not metaphoric, but really treating that as it is. There would be another possible discussion, but this is perhaps, we are already at the end, the role of technology per se within Greek culture, and of course also within this particular scene. It is a kind of technology that accompanies really the rhythm of nature. He's testing the kind of matter trees might have, and also qualities, right, of the signal. So this is also interesting. He's not changing dramatically. He's using, he's adapting what he got in order to build his ship, and then continue with his travel, continue, of course, also the narration of the events, which is the Odyssey. So this passage is really rich, and I am so thankful, of course, to you, Richard, and also Lucas, that I mean, who discussed this text. Sorry, there is a message by Daniel. Hello, the wonderful papers remind me since, I mean, if you want, Daniel, you can also talk, or do you want me to read this? I am on the train. Okay, sorry. So, yeah, I guess you could read the wonderful papers today reminded me that since the 18th and 19th centuries, there has been a continual debate about whether to idolize Homer or emphasize the materialities of his text. And this has political dimension. In the 19th century in Britain, socialist readers like William Morris admired Odysseus' craftsmanship and ignores how Odysseus treats Thersites in Iliad too. Okay, yeah, this is also interesting, of course. And we might think analytical technology in particular. Yeah, of course. I mean, there is the book by Bettina Reitz Josse, which is about building language in Latin literature, to be honest. Okay, guys, thank you so much. I'm afraid we have to close it here. So thank you so much for joining, for presenting this wonderful discussion. We are going to meet again, and please join next week on March 2. We are going to consider a fascinating piece of poetry by contemporary Italian poet Giorgio Caproni, Il passaggio di Enea, which is of course a relationship. I mean, it presents a strong relationship with Virgil. So everybody's welcome. Thank you again, and see you very soon.
Grazie a tutti, buonanotte.
Good night. Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao.